Hey guys, welcome to our next lesson, lesson 10.4. Today we are going to be looking at solving equations in the form x squared plus bx plus c, otherwise known as a quadratic equation, okay? And the first thing that we're going to look at for solving is to solve by factoring. Remember, we've been doing this since chapter 9. We have that table of factoring in Google Classroom, and how we solve by factoring is step 1, make the equation equal to 0. Step 2 is we factor. Remember, we did all of this in chapter 9. I do have the factoring table in Google Classroom, but one of the most common methods of factoring is going to be working backwards, okay? So that's why you've been focusing on that one a little bit more. After we factor in step 3, we set each factor equal to 0. And then step 4 is to solve for x. So let's do our first example here with factoring. And so we have this equation, x squared plus 2x minus 24 equals 0, and we want to solve by factoring. Step 1 is to make the equation equal to 0. That's already done for us. Step 2 is to factor. Again, working backwards is going to be our most common method that we use for moving forward. So in order to work backwards, I need two numbers that add to 2 and that multiply to negative 24. Remember that the sign matters. So we want to add to positive 2, multiply to negative 24. So the two numbers that we end up with are 6 and negative 4. Because 6 times negative 4 equals negative 24, and 6 plus negative 4 equals positive 2, okay? So those are going to be my factors, x plus 6, x minus 4. Now in my next step, step number 3, I set each factor equal to 0. So x plus 6 equals 0, x minus 4 equals 0. And for my final step, all I do in number 4 is solve for x. So here for my first factor, I subtract 6 to both sides, and I get x equals negative 6 as my first answer. I add 4 to both sides, and I get x equals 4 as my second answer. Okay, guys, so to solve this by factoring, this is what it would look like. And remember, these would also be my zeros. So if the directions ever say to find the zeros, it is the same thing as solving for x. Now let's take a look at another way of solving. We just solved by factoring. Now we're going to solve by completing the square. And the first step to solve by completing the square is to replace the y or the f of x with 0. Step 2 is to actually complete the square. We follow the rules from 10.3, which tells us to do b divided by 2 squared. And then we add that on the inside, subtract on the outside of the parentheses. Then in step 3, we change to vertex form, which looks like this. And then we solve and get 2 answers. So let's take a look here of using vertex form to solve. And notice part of why we're going to use vertex form is because the direction asks us to find the vertex and the zeros. So step number 1, set the equation equal to 0. 0 equals x squared minus 8x plus 7. Step 2 is to complete the square. So in order to complete the square, I put parentheses around my x terms. Then I take b is always the number in front of x. I take b and I do negative 8 divided by 2 squared. Negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4 squared, and negative 4 squared is 16. And so what do I do with that 16? I add it inside parentheses. So I'm going to have x squared minus 8x, but now on the inside, I'm going to put plus 16. So this is considered completing the square. Now, if I added 16 inside the parentheses, I have to subtract 16 outside of the parentheses, okay? So that's my final step there in completing the square. Now I am just going to change my equation to vertex form. So I'm going to factor my trinomial here by working backwards. My two factors would end up being x minus 4 and x minus 4. And then when I simplify my numbers out here, 7 minus 16 gives us negative 9. So my final equation in vertex form would be 0 equals x minus 4 squared minus 9. Okay, so here is my final equation in vertex form. So you should now be able to tell me the vertex, because the vertex comes from H and from K. Remember that H is always the opposite and K stays the same. So for my vertex up here in the top left, I'm going to write it here. Since I have x minus 4, my vertex would be positive 4. And then since I have negative 9, I would have keep that negative 9. So my vertex here on the top left would be 4 comma negative 9. Now, in order to do step 4, to solve for x and get my two zeros, I'm going to need a little bit of space. So I'm going to rewrite my vertex form up at the top. 0 equals x minus 4 squared minus 9. And I'm going to erase the work that we have down here, because I will need that space to solve for my zeros. All right, let's get started here with solving for my zeros. So we're on our final step. Here is my vertex form that we came up with, and we are going to go ahead and solve for the zeros. The first thing I need to do is add 9 to both sides. So if I add 9 to both sides, on the right they cross out, and now I am left with 9 equals x minus 4 squared. And notice I'm just carrying my work down here where I have all this white space. From here, to get rid of this square, I square root. If I do it to one side, I do it to the other side. On the right, my square and my square root cross out. So now what I have is 3 equals x minus 4. But please don't forget, the square root of 9 is 3, but the square root of 9 is also negative 3. So I'm going to have 3 equals x minus 4, and I'm also going to have negative 3 equals x minus 4. That's usually the second part that a lot of us forget. Now I just solved for both. I add 4 here on the left, and I get 7 equals x. And for my second factor, I add 4 here, and I get positive 1 equals x. And so there are my two zeros, x equals 7 and x equals 1. And then I have my vertex here in the top left. Okay, so we've solved by factoring, and we've solved now by completing the square. Let's take a look here at our next example. Let f of x equals x squared plus 3x minus 15. Find the values of x when y equals negative 5. And so, very important here in red, what do you think we should do? Okay, you are going to have homework problems just like this. Remember, f of x is just another way of writing y. And if the question is telling us that y equals negative 5, what we're going to do is plug that negative 5 in. So how I should set up this equation is negative 5 equals x squared plus 3x minus 15. Do you see how instead of that f of x, I have now written negative 5, because negative 5 equals y. Okay, now in order to solve this, the equation has to equal 0. So now I'm going to move this negative 5 to the other side. So I add 5 to both sides, and I get 0 equals x squared plus 3x minus 10. Now that I am here, I could either complete the square or I could factor. Factoring is much easier. If you're able to factor, you're going to be able to go through the problem much faster. So I'm going to work backwards here. I need two numbers that add to 3 and that multiply to negative 10. So my two numbers are going to be 5 and negative 2. Okay, 5 plus negative 2 gives me 3, and 5 times negative 2 gives me negative 10. So it meets the requirements. So now I'm going to set up my factors over here on the right. So my two factors would be x plus 5, x minus 2. Now I set each factor up equal to 0. X plus 5 equals 0. X minus 2 equals 0. And now I just solve. I subtract 5 from both sides. I get x equals negative 5. And then I add 2 to both sides. And I get x equals 2. And so here would be my values of x. In this bottom right-hand corner, these are my two values of x. X equals negative 5, x equals 2. And please go back to the slide for your homework because you will have several homework questions like this. And that's it for today's lesson, guys. A nice short little lesson. Make sure you go into Google Classroom, find that 10-4 worksheet, submit it in the appropriate place. This is what your homework will look like. Okay, so notice at the beginning, we're solving by factoring, right? So working backwards. A lot of these are working backwards. Now for the second section, you are completing the square. So making sure you're putting parentheses around those x terms, okay? And then for this very last section, notice this is the example that we just did. They're giving you this equation and they're telling you y equals 12. So what are you doing? Instead of f of x, you're plugging in 12 and then you're gonna solve. Okay, guys? So get that homework done and submit it in Google Classroom. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you guys for our next lesson.